ladies and gentlemen. Good to see you all back. I hope you enjoyed your coffee break. Thanks for being with us this morning, and a warm welcome to everyone joining us online as well for this discussion on building urban resilience in an uncertain world. By 2050, it's estimated 68% of the global population will be living in cities. Demographics are changing. Urbanization is increasing. Cities and towns are hubs for administration, providers of social services, drivers of economic growth. But increased urbanization means that when disaster strikes, the scale of the impact is also increased. Wildfires, floods, storms, these are events we've all heard about. They're affecting tens of millions of people. They have a huge social and economic impact. And of course, they're only likely to get worse because of the uncertainties of climate change. That's why it's imperative that urban centres become more resilient, that vulnerabilities are reduced, particularly amongst the more marginalised populations, and that local and national authorities are able to build their capacity to face future challenges. So during this session, we're going to be discussing how to develop and integrate urban resilience into urban centres, the importance of collaboration, and how standards can aid in those efforts to make human settlements safer and less vulnerable. As ever, translation is available via the Interprefy app, and every so often you will see our lovely scriber Rachel, who is making word art out of all the comments and statements that you will hear during this session, so you'll see them pop up on the screen behind me. But let me introduce our panel of speakers today. I'm very excited to have with me on stage, next to me, Colin Sivalingam, the State Manager of the Emergency Services Queensland for the Australian Red Cross and Red Crescent. Alison Drury, General Manager, Trade and International Branch, Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources here in Australia. Kiri Atira, Director of Planning and Projects at the Ministry of Infrastructure for the Cook Islands. Chantal Gouet, the CEO of Standards Council in Canada, and joining us online, Beck Dawson, Chief Resilience Officer, Sydney at the Resilient Cities Network here in Australia. Warm welcome to all of you. And of course, they will be taking questions from the floor. In fact, we're going to do it a couple of times during the discussion, not just from the floor, I should say, also online. So if you do have questions and you're joining us virtually, then just type those questions into the Q&A box. So let's start by looking at, what do we mean by urban resilience and why does it matter? Let me start with you, Colin, because we've seen and heard of so many natural disasters. Right now, everyone's talking about what's happening, the dreadful events in Derna in Libya, and here in Australia, no stranger to wildfires. Who are the most affected by disasters like that, and what are the challenges of the humanitarian response?
Perfect, Shirley. And firstly, welcome to Queensland and our most disaster-impacted state in Australia. So that's a fantastic idea.
That's a great record to have.
Yes. And especially when we have the highest growth rate from a population movement perspective. And Brisbane is the fastest growing city. So that means more and more people making the most disaster-impacted state the home. And what does that actually mean for us? And some of us, I'm not sure if you had a chance to watch the news last night, and the Bureau of Meteorology officially announced the El Nino in terms of catastrophic heat predictions over the next couple of months. And it means for us in the southern states or in the eastern seaboard and the Pacific is that extreme heat conditions, extreme fire danger. So they're talking catastrophic fires. Now, most people would not know the extreme heat weather or heat waves kill more people in Australia than any other natural disasters put together every year, what we call the silent killer. And what that means for vulnerable communities, this extreme weather conditions is, first define what vulnerability actually looks like. And one of the challenges is that often people would normally only talk about deep vulnerabilities, talking about the disabled, the aged, the young care, basically. But anybody can be vulnerable during a disaster, immaterial of what the social standing is. And we've seen this in this part of the world. We've got the Brisbane River just behind us. We've seen in the last floods last year that communities that have never historically been flooded were flooded. So the level of resilience is extremely low for those community members that haven't seen this type of flood.
Because they're suddenly facing disasters that they've not had to face before.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And these are becoming worse.
Or they're used to a different type of disaster. So they're used to bushfires, for example. They come to Queensland, they're listening to and they're experiencing flooding or cyclones. And so I think that's one of the things, the biggest issues that we're experiencing at the moment in terms of vulnerability communities. But also vulnerable communities is often have lack of access to support. And or they just don't have the means to access support. So more and more that gap is getting bigger and bigger. And I think one of the things is that all the struggling in terms of challenges, the biggest challenge what we're facing in the sector at the moment, what are called the non-obvious issues. So response agencies are generally, is what physically you can see. You can see the house has damage, you can see the fire, but the non-direct are the psychosocial impacts, the long-term impacts on the health system, the long-term impacts on individuals in terms of the mental health, the well-being, which is something that not easily measured, not easily funded because you don't really see it. And this has huge implications on populations long-term, especially the most vulnerable communities. What we're seeing now is more and more people moving to urban, to city areas. And it's funny that because we're moving and we live very close proximity in apartment blocks and buildings, but we're socially more distant. Because unlike suburban areas, you know who the neighbors are, and you know that somebody is vulnerable in the community. You know how to prepare for disasters. Most people live in city blocks, don't know who's living right next door.
Somehow less personal.
Less personal, but yet in close proximity, but further socially isolated. That makes disaster actors, when it comes to needs assessments, and really quickly to determine what a community need, very, very difficult to do. Because you're not there, it's not physical, you can't identify what the needs are. So these are biggest challenges that we experience in terms of identifying need really quickly, especially when infrastructure goes down, communication infrastructures, road infrastructure, utilities that actually go down. So for agencies that do community needs assessment to respond and support community, that's very, very difficult and a big challenge to experience for communities that need support really quickly.
Okay, Colin, thank you. Alison, one of the biggest events that has touched all of our lives, I guess, is the COVID pandemic, and we saw how that affected economies and entire countries and supply chains. So what does urban resilience mean in that context? How does it tie into quicker recovery, more sustainable systems?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. And look, it's really wonderful to be here. And perhaps I might just start with a quote, if you don't mind, from Australia's National Science Organisation, the CSIRO, and this was in a report to the Prime Minister. And they said, the COVID-19 pandemic is a timely reminder of how hazards within the complex and changing global risk landscape can affect lives, livelihoods and health. It provides for a compelling case for an all-hazards approach to achieve risk reduction as a basis for sustainable development. And I think that this point around, sort of really, the changing global risk landscape is a particularly pertinent one. And of course, it wasn't just COVID-19 that I think that we've been faced with here in Australia, but a sort of confluence of enormous sort of challenges, including natural hazards. And I think some of these have already been touched on, but just to give a sense of the scale of what some of our communities are dealing with. In 2019 to 2020, Australia's bushfires burnt an estimated 243,000 square kilometres of land. That's the size of the United Kingdom, which gives you a sense of the scale of what we're facing here. Those fires destroyed over 3,000 buildings and killed at least 34 people. Similarly, in 2020, severe flooding that Australia sort of experienced down the eastern seaboard. 22 people are known to have died, caused close to $5 billion worth in damage. And in urban centres, almost 1,000 schools had to be closed on account of those the disruption that those floods caused. And at the risk of making this a really kind of grim, session, I think what we are facing is through climate change, the reality that some of these challenges and some of these disruptions are going to become even more sharply felt in years to come. While tropical cyclones, which have already been mentioned, scientists are predicting that they're going to decrease, the intensity is going to increase. Extreme rainfall events are projected to increase with intensity. Heat waves, extreme hot days that now occur sort of once every 20 years are expected to occur every 2 to 5 years
and
by
it's
2050.
a lot longer as well.
And a lot longer. That's exactly right. So, we've got this confluence of sort of natural events compounded by the fact that, as has already been mentioned, we've got more, greater numbers of the population living in urban areas. So how do we manage natural hazards, which is one part of the story? And of course, the Australian government, for its part, is sort of looking at managing climate change, through a commitment to net zero by 2050. But then there's also a question about, how do we reduce exposure and how do we sort of manage vulnerability? And perhaps one of the examples that I thought I might just briefly touch on is some work that's being done in the department, which I come from through our Australian Building Codes Board, which is really looking at ways that we can make our commercial and residential buildings more resilient and resistant to climate hazards. So there's a particular focus in the context of bushfire, extreme wind, cyclone, and extreme heat. We're looking at how we can improve standards in the context of this discussion around why standards matter to improve the energy efficiency of our buildings. And that question of energy efficiency, I think, when we talk about urban resilience, when we talk about urban areas, is even more important, given the fact that urban areas are responsible for some 71% of global energy-related carbon emissions, in spite of the fact that they only represent about 3% of the total sort of land area globally. So there is a responsibility, I think, in terms of thinking about urban areas and the contribution that they can make to responding and mitigating to climate by drawing in some of these sort of more resilient, resistant, building standards to both reduce energy efficiency but also improve resilience.
Thank you. And I think there's a particular risk and threat faced by small island nations, coastal areas, especially impacted by climate disasters, which I think Alison mentioned there as well. Kiri, the Cook Islands, particularly prone to severe tropical cyclones. Tell me what happens there and what urban resilience means for your nation.
Well, for us, being a small island, a developing state, along with my other Pacific brethren here, we all are on the front line of what climate change is doing to us. Some of us are losing land. Urban resilience for us might look like some, either building higher, or if we've got the landscape or the land to, moving higher up. We can't stop what's happening. We can only try and adapt and change what we're doing. As a region, we're all working, trying to pool our resources, because we all have human resource constraints in our tiny little island states. So we're trying to pool and network our resources together to try and find a collective solution for the Pacific Islands and our people.
Paint a picture for us. When one of these tropical cyclones has struck a city, what is the kind of damage that you're seeing?
Well, in the 1980s, Cyclone Martin ripped through one of our northern group of islands and devastated Manihiki. Lives were lost, people were washed out to sea. There's stories of parents tying their children to coconut trees to stop them from being washed away. It just completely flattened the island, and we were grateful for the support of larger states that came in and provided us, assistance. Red Cross were there as well. So, it's not. I think something else we are looking at, is early warning systems. Developing those, making sure that we're prepared, that our leaders know, what it means. So some of it, when we talk about capacity building, it isn't just about the technical staff, or it is actually getting our leaders involved and getting them learned, if you like, so that they know what it means. A lot of our leaders do know in our small island states, but it's our traditional leaders. So, we're all of us in the Pacific, we're very strong in our cultural beliefs. And our culture is in everything we do. It's in our policies, it's in our standards, our local standards. even to the type of materials we build with.
Right. So how much of your policies are about looking at what's happened in the past, the way disasters, the cyclones have affected you, and trying to build on them to mitigate the threat? Because you're never going to prevent the cyclones, I guess, until we get a grip on climate change. So you've got to deal with it, and you have to face it. Do you feel that is happening?
Absolutely. So we are increasing the building standards. We have adopted quite a few with regards to making sure we're building resilient buildings, something they're kind of like rescue centres, refuge centres, where people can go during a natural disaster or an event and be safe and not have to worry about tying their children to trees or, and then it has an impact on our water. People are talking about cyclones, increased rain intensity. We also have the issue with drought. So it's not too much water, it's not enough water. So finding solutions for that.
So you've got multiple problems
absolutely.
That you have to find. I will definitely talk to you more about what you're doing there and how you're working on that approach. Chantal, international standards sound like they're going to be key here in helping build urban resilience. Talk us through ISO's approach to this.
I think that all the issues that you have raised are very important and difficult challenges to tackle. And certainly, we believe that bringing people together to identify those issues and design solutions to mitigate or adapt is really, I guess, what the standardization system has to offer. So you've all mentioned standards. It's like almost like, why am I here, right? You're all talking about needing standards. And I think that the beauty of this process is the sharing of best practices, the sharing of lessons learned, and the output being guidance, right? Could be an international standard, but guidance and tools to help support. And ISO has been developing solutions linked to climate change for decades. We started with environmental management, but you talked about the built environment. There's lots of work done by the technical community around buildings being more resilient, right? Great series of standards actually developed under the leadership of Canada to adapt to climate change, measure the risk, understand the risks, and then have a methodology to adapt your infrastructure and mitigate. And we've done good documents for dedicated for local government and cities, and so I think that what we can provide is solutions to those very challenging issues. And again, what's so important is what's so beautiful about the process is that we can hear the voices of those that are impacted and those that have experience. You talk about flooding, right? We have flooding too. You talk about wildfires. We have wildfires too. So it's such a beautiful platform, again, to find solutions because we don't have time. You all know the clock is ticking. So if we can put our experiences, knowledge, best practices together, we can support and help each other. And it's so critical. And I think that's what ISO has to offer.
Beck, let me bring you in here because this is very much your wheelhouse. We've heard a lot about some of the types of disasters that are affecting urban areas. We've talked about the need to strengthen urban resilience. But what are the challenges of that? I mean, when it comes to implementing resilience measures, what works, what doesn't?
Yeah, good question. So the context across the floor is that you can see clearly that the scale of the challenge coming towards us. I guess the challenge of how that lays out in place and how we talk about the place-based ideas of what we need to manage altogether and the way that we understand those risks. What doesn't work is when we don't have a shared view of how to define them, how to describe them, how to use those tools and guidelines that the others have been talking about. So when we don't have those structures in place that enable us to collaborate and understand the same problem in the same way together, that really stops us from making change and improving the situation. So if people don't know what to worry about, for example, we're only looking at one hazard at a time. In a city context, we need to look at the way they layer together, so shocks and stresses, the way they interact, so the underlying vulnerabilities of the city, as well as understanding then what's going to happen if you put a big shock event, any kind of shock event, over the top of that, not just natural hazards, but economics and potentially other social risks as well. So using structures and I guess enabling that all hazards approach in a city context has been really important here in Sydney. We've used, I guess, the simple way to describe it is, in a city like Sydney, we have 100 different organisations that manage all the city systems. So like things like water and energy, understanding how the transport system works, understanding how the social fabric of the place operates. So I effectively need a governance arrangement and structures and language that all those 100 organisations can work together to use to explain to each other how those risks impact each of them. So when we talk about resilience in a city context, we ask the really basic question of resilience for whom. So it's not just for those businesses, but also for all of the people that you're describing who live in the city. So in Sydney, the 5 million people that are going to be impacted by the decisions that all of those 100 organisations make. Some of them are governments, some of them are businesses, and some of them are community or not-for-profit and community organisations. So from our perspective, clearly understanding the risks together, having a clear view in place of what matters in what order, for whom is a really stage one. Having targets and, if you like, I guess, priorities about what we think are going to matter in that place. How do we explain that to each other and then put them in some sort of order? And then what kind of programs and capacity building can we then collectively invest in or agree that we're going to then, if you like, pick off the key issues that are going to make the most impact to adapt to the conditions that we have coming and the kinds of challenges that we know we're going to face in our city.
Beck, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to take a quick pause at this juncture and see if there are any questions from the floor on what we've heard so far before we continue the discussion. Does anyone have anything that they want to ask? Gentleman in the fifth row here, if you wouldn't mind standing up, sir, so that...
It's actually a sharing thing.
Do you want to wait for the microphone and then the people online can hear you as well? Thank you.
Jason Brown. I'm in a number of technical committees, but the one that's key to this is TC 292, Security and Resilience. And I'm hoping to make everyone aware of the range of standards on resilience for community, resilience for organisation, emergency management. So if you go to TC 292 online on the web, there's all the list of the standards absolutely relevant to this work.
Brilliant.
And it's really good stuff.
TC 292.
TC 292,
Thank
Security
you.
and Resilience. Thank you.
Super, thank you for that. Any more comments or questions?
There's one in the back.
Did you see a hand up there?
There's
Chantal?
one in the back.
Yeah, okay. If you wouldn't mind standing up, thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Tak Leong from SSE Singapore. So far, the discussion is more on like infrastructure, natural disasters. But how about resilience in terms of supply chains, in terms of like food, in terms of fuels, in terms of flows of materials? How do we address some of these challenges?
Yeah, great question. That's probably either one for Beck or one for Alison. Beck, do you want to take that one?
I'm happy to take that one. So here in Sydney, we did an all hazards approach to understanding our kind of shocks and stresses for the city, and that includes supply chain challenges like, a very high reliance in our city, for example, on liquid fuels that arrive on a boat from Singapore pretty much every day. And of course, other issues to do with cyber attacks or digital infrastructure and networks that does then implicate all of the supply chains as well. But of course, in COVID, we discovered really clearly here in Australia, all the supply chains we rely on, deliver, if you like, just-in-time delivery of foods, equipment, medicines that are required for everyday life in Australia. So it's caused a bit of a rethink in a lot of parts of the country. But here in Sydney, we were clear about that. We've got a major program to look and try and drive electrification of our city as a resilience measure, which will also lead to some net zero or low carbon outcomes for the city that will also help to mitigate climate change, as an example. So we're looking to understand not just how those things happen in each, if you like, kind of thematic or issue that you're raising there. It's how that will then, if you like, be solved by the way we understand the other risks and challenges. So how can we be sensible about what changes we're making or what investments we're going to do, because they have multiple benefits across many hazards at once. So all of those things are things we're thinking about certainly here, but it's the way that you understand how they knit together in the solutions that's going to be really important going forward for the way that we make resourcing decisions and what we can change.
Beck, thanks very much. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I might just add to that from a federal government perspective, because I think you're absolutely right that, I think there have been a couple of drivers that have really drawn this question of supply chain resilience into sharp relief. And of course, the COVID pandemic was one of them, where we saw sort of real lumpiness across the globe in terms of the availability and supply of certain, goods, but services as well. But equally, I think, the Russia-Ukraine crisis has been absolutely, pivotal in terms of, placing pressure on supply chains, particularly as you mentioned around energy supply chains. What the Australian government is doing on this is we've actually set up an Office of Supply Chain Resilience, which is really at the forefront in terms of sort of looking at, where do the vulnerabilities lie for Australia in terms of our international interconnectedness, our global connectedness, where are those sort of real critical risks in terms of our supply chains, and we've gone through a massive process of looking to map them so that we can better respond to crises when they emerge. It's a big exercise, it's a difficult one to do, and of course I think when it does come to supply chains, the international context matters absolutely. So, from my friend there from Singapore, I know that the Australian government and Singapore, for example, are working very closely together on building, supply chain resilience. Our leaders have announced a supply chain, working group focused very much, with a food pact included in that, but also looking at broader supply chain resilience, how we can build some early warning emergency mechanisms into responding to supply chain supply chain challenges, to make sure that our resilience, both at a domestic level but at a regional level and a global level, can be further enhanced. So, I think that there's a lot more to do. There are platforms internationally where we can sort of continue to work together. The Indo-Pacific Economic Cooperation, for example, that's got a dedicated supply chain pillar focused on building that supply chain resilience through the region. And I know that Australia is, very much looking forward to working with regional partners, but more globally, to really enhance our understanding of supply chain vulnerabilities and address them through, for example, those early warning mechanisms.
Do you want to make a
just comment on an example of what Alison is saying is that we're seeing an interesting trend, the supply chain, especially with the retail network and the supermarket chains. There are lots of supermarket chains that traditionally sat outside the disaster sector. Now they're part of the discussion, they're in the table. They have huge logistics infrastructure, and feeding communities and making sure that communities and supermarkets are fully stocked is an essential component. They're now in the discussion. So the rail network, how do they get stocks across, right down to the detail about how they stock the shelving, for example, and so that you don't see this over-purchasing and rushed purchasing taking place, to make sure that you can have good supply of basic human needs. So there's definitely a trend in that at the table, some good examples now.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. There will be opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session as well. And I should add that you'll have the opportunity to meet all the speakers in the Unplugged corner as well. I'll give you details about that at the end of the session. Let's carry on with the discussion. And Kiri, I want to pick up with you. I want to examine the role of standards a bit more. You were talking about building better buildings to try and withstand storms and cyclones. From your point of view, how do standards improve resilience for island nations, and are there gaps that need to be filled?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I spoke about it earlier. It's more about the capacity building with regards to adopting and adapt. We, as a region, would like to adapt some of the standards so that they're a bit more specific to our Pacific needs. You know, we don't have the land masses that a lot of the larger states have. Therefore, we're a little bit more vulnerable to some of the, you know, immediate effects of climate change and weather events and changing patterns. So we all in our own small island states have different ways of approaching standards. So in the Cooks, for example, we don't have a national standards body. We're not big enough. You know, our population is 17,500 people. So we all of our ministries deal with our own relevant standards ourselves. That in itself creates gaps. It also creates a bit of an overlap in some instances when you think about the police and transport and infrastructure. You know, we all are trying to achieve the same thing, but coming at it from different angles. So, I would keep referring to them as my Pacific siblings, we all face very similar challenges with regards to capacity and knowledge and technology and innovation. You know, so being part of ISO, not as a member, has been an absolute pleasure, because we've all learned in our own way little things that we can take back that we need to talk to our leaders about in regards to considering either ISO membership or getting more involved, trying to, you know, not just sit at the table with the adults, but because we're all in our infancy in terms of standards and how we're delivering them in our countries, you know, growing up a bit and getting the help we need and support, you know, whether that's skill sharing or training. For a lot of us, it's funding. You know, we just don't have the economic structure to be able to put a lot of these implementations, or changes in place. So I think that's a big thing for us, small island states.
That's really interesting what you're saying. I'm going to ask your response to this, Chantal. And I think this comes down to, we've spoken about this before, the importance of collaboration in helping nations like Kiri's deal with the fact that they have resource shortages and they don't have a national standards body. How does collaboration help when it comes to resilience efforts and sustainable development?
I think it's at the center of success. If we want to be successful at tackling resilience or becoming more resilient and tackling climate change, collaboration is key. We don't have the luxury of time anymore. We all know, especially those nations that have been touched by disaster, that the clock is ticking. So we need to work together. It's essential. So for that first reason, timeliness, right? We need everybody. The second part is what Beck was referring to earlier, is the domino effect, right? It's not because it's happening in one part of the city or it affects more one sector that is not going to touch the other sectors, right? So there's a domino effect that happens. It makes it very complex. So we need to collaborate between areas, between groups. And thirdly, we need to be ensuring that the most vulnerable communities are affected by climate change are heard. So it's essential. So collaboration for those three reasons: timeliness, the complexity and the domino effect, and ensuring that the vulnerable communities are heard and we are helping them.
So trying to engage different stakeholders so that the gaps that Kiri was talking about are filled.
Yes.
Yeah. Alison, let me come to you. We've spoken a little bit about, vulnerability, supply chains. When it comes to economies, as we're all aware, now have to be more agile and more responsive to deal with these brute shocks and global circumstances. How do international standards help with that, and what kind of examples can you give?
Yeah, sure. And maybe I'll couch this response in the context of climate change and adaptation, because I think, the conversation that we've had so far around some of the major challenges that we as global communities are facing sort of really demonstrate the need, yes, for agility. They demonstrate the need for responsiveness. And, I think that point that's just been made around sort of collaboration is a really crucial one. But I think also that point around sort of timeliness is also incredibly important. And I think this is where standards come in. If we're looking at the urgency with which governments around the world are looking to transition their economies to a low emissions future, time is of the essence. And I think that the real challenge here and the risk is that some of the systems and processes, including around standard setting, need to be able to be as agile and responsive as the challenge and the changes that we're facing ourselves. So, the pace, like I say, the pace of change, the urgency that we're facing, really raises a question, I think, around, whether we can at an international level shift our standard setting system to be able to respond with that same level of agility and responsiveness. And I know, and I can point to Standards Australia here, which here in the Australian context has just been doing an incredible job in terms of really thinking about how can we be responsive in standard setting. Mm-hmm. But, this needs to be managed at an international level, because international standards are just so crucial in terms of, providing that global sort of confidence around products and services, but and also, where they can be adopted internationally, provide that sort of level of harmonisation across economies that help facilitate trade. And I think that's why, that international standard setting, international standards that can be responsive to the needs of the global community, that can be developed in a timely way, and then can be developed with industry input and developed in a way that provides for sort of harmonisation across economies and a reduction to barriers of trade is really the approach that we should be looking to make. And that will, by its nature, help reinforce, that agility and responsiveness that we're kind of looking for in terms of being able to respond to the sort of question of urban resilience.
So some really interesting points being made about collaboration. Beck, I know your network is very focused on bringing together stakeholders to overcome, help with recovery, to empower communities. Talk us through that and the kind of things that can be achieved through effective collaboration.
Yeah, thank you. So we're really using that kind of network of networks model here in Sydney, because resilience is the core challenge for resilience in Sydney is governance, because of our structures and 3 layers of government, a lot of those complexities that are being described. So we effectively run a program with all the 33 local governments of the city coming together. We bring those mayors and leaders together, we bring the CEOs and general managers together, we bring the operators of the city together to try and solve structurally and in effect create localised standards and a maturity model for what is it, where are we now and where do we need to get to. So that provides a runway and a roadmap and a structure of how we do it. But a practical example of how that plays out is, for example, when we look at any one kind of core hazard in the city. So we've just established the Greater Sydney Heat Task Force, which is bringing through the 25 key organisations that either work with communities on the ground right through to the people who manage the Bureau of Meteorology and some of the weather data, but also build some of the building standards and structures that work in New South Wales, for example. We've got them coming together to create a heat smart city plan with a structure on how we do developments on the ground, with rating suburbs, like are they heating or cooling people, which obviously has context to lots of different rules about the way we set planning decisions for land use and building typologies. But then we're also working with communities to set local heatwave management plans. So working with, for example, community organisations, working with vulnerable communities on the ground who might need support in a heatwave, like Colin was describing earlier. What do we need to provide? Like, where are they going to go? What does the refuge look like? Will the pool be open later? So what are the standards in an operating sense of the city that also might help support, at a practical level, how people are going to manage and navigate those risks on the day? And what's the communications that we're all going to then put out to make it clear how people can respond, what they can do, etc. And can I just note, I thought Alison's comment there is really important about this, agility to make those standards more quickly. We're inventing these changes as we go as a collaboration and finding lots of places where we're just not up to scratch, or we don't understand what good looks like. We have to sit together, we have to do that process. And funding the governance process is really hard, but it's actually the piece that then enables you to make those decisions together and move more quickly. So that kind of more agile way of working across a governance layer in the city is something we'd recommend to any place that's trying to understand how to do this work and how to make that context right down to the ground. And to Chantel's point, with the community engagement process tied into it so that you understand what matters on the ground to people who have to live with it.
Can I just ask a supplementary question, Beck? And I'm being a little bit of a devil's advocate here. I don't want to be all doom and gloom, but it's clear that these kind of, especially climate-generated disasters, are going to keep happening. They're going to affect more and more people. Is it possible to plan and mitigate every contingency?
The short answer is we can probably imagine most of them, and so you can kind of imagine what they might be, but there's not the, if I would describe the social license to operate or the kind of political will at this stage to make the decisions that we need to make to mitigate all those options. I would say in theory you can do a lot of work towards mitigating those things, but we're really unlikely anywhere in the world to decide to do it at the right scale. It's really hard to also choose. We've described already the resourcing across the table today. I feel for the Cook Islands. I can imagine that's extremely difficult. Even in Sydney, I find it really hard to get money directed into those adaptations and structures. Even when we've got the collaboration, we've decided what we want to do, it's still hard to resource. So I think how our mechanisms of understanding the business case and the investment psychology of what we are choosing to do for whom in terms of resilience is a really nascent art at this stage. It's something I think we need a lot more practice on. We need to share resources and ideas across the world of how we hack the way we make economic decisions about these things to help support more communities to be better responding to the things that are more likely to happen.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, the business case for investment. Bringing it back to perhaps standards and measures that we can take to try and mitigate the risks. Colin, what needs to be strengthened? What needs to be changed? What will make a difference?
Well, with interest, I was listening to our learned colleagues on stage here, and I think I'll reflect on some of the points that was actually mentioned. And I know Alison mentioned this, and Kiri mentioned as well, around cyclone and cyclone codes up north. And if you look at, probably the best way to answer this is to give you a real-life example, is that cyclone codes and building code standards up in the northern part of the country, the building codes for a certain cyclone standard. Now, more and more, we're seeing the cyclones are tracking down south. Mm-hmm. And 2021, we had Cyclone Saraja on the western coast that came right down, which is in the equivalent line of Brisbane and the Gold Coast. Now, the community got impacted there. None of that community houses were built on a cyclone standard. And so Cyclone Saraja made landfall on a Category 3. People thought it was just a windy day, and it took out the roofs of all those houses. Goodness. That community was not prepared for that. Now, if we use that same thinking, it's not unimaginable to have a cyclone coming right down to Brisbane and the Gold Coast. Now, these communities are not prepared for a cyclone. The houses are not built to a cyclone code. Now, I'm not saying that the cost and economic impact of actually doing something that is quite expensive, but we should be thinking about it. We should be thinking that what will the impact be of those highly populated communities?
So we have to start thinking about things that haven't even happened
Absolutely.
yet.
And I genuinely believe future generations will judge us for the decisions we make today.
Yeah.
And we really need to think about those communities and what that actually happens. And I know we spoke about vulnerable communities, and Chantal was saying this, is that the recent event that we experienced in New South Wales and Queensland, the homeless community was significantly impacted because they did not get the early warning messages. Right? But they didn't have the means to get the early warning messages. And even after they got impacted, the general homes are the bridge, under the bridge, and didn't qualify for fundings and support and so forth because they don't have a fixed address. So when you talk about vulnerable communities, we really need to do that engagement, thinking who are the deep vulnerability in those communities. I know Beck spoke about funding and economic impacts, and I think this is quite an interesting thing when we talk about resilience and preparedness, and to move out of funding that sits in election cycles. And somebody came up with a 3-year plan and said, oh, that'll be 3 years it'll take that community to recover. Maybe that's an election period. Now, bipartisan approach is required. That communities will take long to recover, that we need long time to prepare communities for future disasters.
Right. Okay, Colin, thank you very much. Thank you to all my speakers for the comments so far. I think at this juncture we'll get more questions from the floor. I think we've heard some really interesting things about the importance of collaboration, of resourcing, but building standards into public policy, which is going to help hopefully make a difference to mitigate the damage done in future disasters. Have we got any questions from the floor? Okay, so I'm looking. There's a couple there. If you put your hand up and a microphone, hopefully will come to you. I'll take you in turn. Gentleman at the end first, and then gentleman on the next row. Yeah. If you stand up for us as well, so the camera can find you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Frank Leberg from AFNOR France. So, Chantal, you mentioned the timely problem that we have to face, but back to a discussion we had in Sydney with some Australian committee technical chair. There's also the innovation that we should have on board, because they put on the table an example of some solution to mitigate the risks, to adapt our worlds to this high risk, could be paradoxically going in the wrong direction. Let me take an example. If we want to be more resistant to typhoon, we could put more concrete in the solution. So we need innovations to be standardized. We need them, because otherwise we can get the problem worse and worse. So it's important that we have every stakeholders, and among them innovation. Thank you.
Do you want to comment on that, Chantal?
I fully agree. And I think that the broader the communities we interact with, and I'm thinking about in particular Indigenous knowledge here, it's going to help us a lot, right? They have been observing nature and the cycles of nature for tens of thousands of years, and I think we can learn. So certainly I know that in Canada we're doing a lot of work with Indigenous communities to better understand where the knowledge and be able to use that knowledge, because they are often the most impacted communities as well, certainly in my country.
Thank you. There was a question in the row behind. If you'd like to stand up, please, sir. Thank you.
This is Balish. Thanks for your good, really important topics. But there's the one point I want to raise. They are talking about the present and the past and the future. But the future, you want to put the more funding for to get the really shaping up the current standards and other things. How the ISO is working on to the throwing the fundings into the resilience building and shaping up the standards. So that's the one question. And also, say from the current gap knowledge, there's the gap knowledge into this. If you see the current existing buildings, we do have the lot of drawbacks on there. How we are going to reinforce those infrastructures, especially for the natural disaster. So we have a lot of history and data is missing. If you want to future forecasting, we have to invest the money to there and to get the records on that one to tackle this event. So how is that standards is working on that?
I don't know if ISO would deal with funding, but certainly you would deal with making the recommendations for the kind of buildings that need to be built in order to withstand those kind of disasters. I guess the question is, how do we change what's already there? Because that's going to take a heck of a lot of money and investment. Kiri, maybe you could take this one, because you clearly know what needs to be done. You know what caliber of building is going to have to withstand the storms. How do you actually get to that point where you have those buildings? Because funding is a big part of it.
Absolutely. So we do rely on ODA, or overseas donor aid, to help us to build new infrastructure. We went through and did a stock take of all of our existing buildings and determine whether or not we could renovate or rehab them into becoming compliant, so that they could serve as a refuge for local communities. most of them, they didn't comply. You know, the amount of money it would cost to retrofit them and bring them up to standard was more than building a new one, pretty much. So we leave them as community centres, and then we end up building new buildings. So we're still currently working through building new cyclone centres for our Pain or our outer islands in the Cooks at the moment.
Beck, do you want to comment on this? Because as a journalist, I've reported on several earthquakes, sadly, quite recently, where buildings were just not up to code and hadn't been built up to code for many, many decades. How do you tackle that and get international standards integrated into sort of public policy when it comes to building new buildings?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the question from the floor was also about what's the knowledge gap that enables you to, if you like, evidence why you need to do that too, right? In Sydney, we've created something called the Resilient Sydney Data Platform, which is a single benchmarking platform that describes how many buildings we have of what type broadly across the whole city, where are they at risk, and from an energy efficiency standard and thinking about the sort of other things that we might then incorporate in the way that they get upgraded, what's coming. So we've also got a scenario builder that sort of says what's likely in the growth trajectory of the city. So we can start to measure and numericize, if you like, where does the money need to go, if you like, broadly, or where are we asking for the system to start investing in changing the building that's going to be there, whether that's retrofitting them or setting better standards for what we've got growing, about to be delivered out in the growth of the city. So we've got some structures in place now that are starting to identify the numbers of those by places in the city, and that means it's lined up with the politicians to talk about, well, what do we need to do in this place that matters to this community, and that's helping drive some of the decision making back up through the policy chain as well. So I think data is really, really important to help understand and contextualise the size and scale of those challenges. In terms of what are we actually doing, so yeah, there's I mentioned before, just for example, on heat, there's some new tools that we've helped create and worked with others across Sydney to build, for example, the Cool Suburbs rating tool, which is available online if you Google it, and that's really setting a standard for development that would articulate in the urban design plan, so what's on the street, what's in the local park, what kind of buildings are going to make a place that cools people. But broadly under the building codes, I know there's a lot of work. Alison, you mentioned it before. It's great to see it coming. Currently, the buildings we're building in Sydney won't keep a person alive without energy input in the heat waves we have already, let alone the ones that are coming. So we still have a lot of work to do to get to a point where even just a building is going to provide what I would describe as basic life safety under a range of hazards.
Beck, thank you. Another question?
Comment on that.
Yeah, go.
Just to finish on that. And I think it's a two-pronged approach, and really absolutely support that. More investment in resilience, build back better strategies, flood-proof, fire-proof, and so forth, our homes and so forth. But let's not take away the individual community responsibility. There's a reason why cities are built near rivers, right? Where we are at the moment is we're in a floodplain. That's where we are. Now, it'll be impossible to relocate entire communities. As much as we're trying to build back and have good codes, at the same time, the investment in community resilience is accepting that we live where we holiday, where we work, there's going to be hazards and there's going to be risk all the time, and changing that mindset. And that individual mindset would lead to a community mindset change.
Thank you. Another question from the floor? Let's come down to the front here. This lady at the end. And then if I have time, I'll come to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the panels for the fascinating discussion. I'm Claire Ripley from Standards Australia. Beck, I was reflecting on my question. You sort of just answered it, but I was reflecting on the complexity of this conversation and the links between urban resilience, our ambition towards net zero in the built environment and across our society, and also the digitalization as well, and all the opportunities that we have with new technologies to enhance what we're doing in all these other areas. So in short, it's a very complex fabric, and Beck, the example you just gave of the data platform, I think is a really interesting one of how you bring all this together and help make it real at a local level. You mentioned before the challenges of 3 layers of government. this is at the city level, and this is where a lot of it happens practically. But for national standards bodies here in the room, and in fact for this international conversation, I'd be really interested on your reflections and the rest of the panel's reflections on how we tackle that, harmonisation across, for example, in Australia, across a federation of states and territories, but then at the international level. Obviously, we believe that standards are part of that, but it would be interesting to hear some reflections on the practical challenges and success stories too of scaling all this up and learning from each other.
Thank you. Great question. Well, Beck, do you want to
Sure.
start?
Happy to jump in. So we're part of a group of 100 cities around the world in the Resilient Cities Network, and we've had the great honour and privilege of working with a whole bunch of cities who are doing standards and creating that in other countries and jurisdictions that many of you may know. So, for example, the City of Manchester and the UK program on standardising and understanding city resilience has been really important and useful for our work. So the first thing is, it's really important, but it's also international, because I think when we can use, and I think one of your previous questioners rated and noted how important it is to use that work that's been done in other jurisdictions to help us understand what happens here. The complexity of the 3 layers of government is not completely unique to Sydney. In Australia, we have it in Paris, and lots of South American countries are often similar. So also understanding, well, how are they hacking that process? What's the way in which we create those lines of how we join together and have those conversations? I think in terms of standards, I think what's really important is actually that they need to be usable. And a lot of the stuff I see coming down from many different types of organisations, they're just really too complicated for people at the local level to implement easily. And I think, we often, if you like, structure them into things that become very practical in the local context that helps that process happen more quickly. If it takes you, lots of days to even understand how the standard works before you're going to use it, then that's probably too difficult for many different jurisdictions to be able to make sense of or communicate clearly with the other layers about which bit of it we're doing. So I think I would just say, actually getting the users of those standards, who do you think is going to be using this document in front of you, in the room, in the context of using and creating those standards, is super, super important. Testing it properly, like you do with agile development of anything, that mechanism and approach is really common now. There are lots of different ways of understanding how we make changes in our cities and societies, and I think this is a place where we could probably be more effective by working together and being more clever about the way we do that process.
Well, you're in exactly the right place to talk about complexity of standards. Chantal, do you want to just make a little comment about who are when it comes to the users, how easy it is for standards to be implemented in situations like this?
Well, I think that Beck made a comment that we hear, I guess often, and that's why I think that over the years, certainly at ISO, we've been trying to develop some guidance documents to implement them, but certainly plain language so that we can use them easily and communicate, what is the intent? Clearly, I think is certainly something we need to continue to work on,
because this is
we're not there yet.
Such a critical area. Thank you. Look, we are very close to the end of the time. Do we just have? It was this lady over here in the middle. Very quick question and answer, and I think we're okay if we run over a couple of minutes, because it's. I know it's lunch next, but just bear with us.
Thank you, and apologies. My name is Cindy Varnier. I'm representing New Caledonia. My question is for Beck. I just want to come back to that all hazards approach that you mentioned. I know that that's something that's quite paramount for Resilient Cities for Resilient Sydney and other cities that have gone through the Resilient Cities network. It's supported an identification of strengths and weaknesses and the state of resilience for Sydney. My question is, can you summarise a few points of what worked well when you completed that, all hazards approach and that resilience assessment, and perhaps what you might do differently if you were to do it again, just so that others might be informed by your approach? Thank you.
Thank you.
Great question. So really simply, it was really important to do that all hazards approach, but using the language of shocks and stresses, to the point that Chantal made about using really everyday language to describe the challenges, meant that we could have a conversation, the same conversation with the community about what those hazards were and how they layered together, in the same way that I can have it with the politicians in Parliament, the same way I can have it with actually people who run all the infrastructure, because they can make sense of that language and we can all understand we're talking about the same things. So kind of keeping the language really simple and straightforward has been a really important part of that. In terms of the all hazards, like absolutely, my view is it's the only way to make this sense of this stuff in place. Just talking about only natural hazards really impedes your ability to understand the kind of benefits you're going to get from the sorts of interventions you might make. So certainly we have the benefit, if you like, of going around again. So we've just done a strategy in Sydney. We've built it out, had 5 years of implementation, and we're now starting a new development process. We will use the same methodology. And so it says, look at all the shocks, understand all the vulnerabilities of the stresses, layer all the shocks together and look at a heat map and say, well, which ones amplify each other, and look at the shocks and against the stresses and say which of those stresses amplify the shocks. And that gives you a really quick heat map. And that's why, if you like, extreme and urban heat was this top shock for Sydney, which was unexpected. It wasn't at the time on the state risk register for New South Wales. We called it out, to Colin's point, as the silent killer of the city. It affects 100% of the population every year. It affects infrastructure. It affects and puts measures and impacts the way people move around the city. It has a direct economic impact, and it also broadly, obviously, disrupts social mechanisms and the way people communicate, connect and use the city every day when it's really hot. So heat became something that we pushed right to the very top. It's not insurable in the city mostly at the moment. We don't have financial mechanisms to structure it, but it gives you an example of when you understand how those shocks and stresses layer together. But you can also see in Sydney, for example, Western Sydney has a really high proportion of people with chronic illness. I can also numericise and know, using that kind of method, where in Sydney is it going to have the biggest impact? It's going to be the place with the lowest delivery of health services and the highest chronic illness framework in that community. And I know exactly how that is going to present and how many ambulances we're going to need. And there's a lot on a heat day. So I think that kind of mechanism of really using that sort of structure of simple language to describe how we understand that complex layering of hazards, to then put it in numbers and consequence analysis in place that describes exactly what is it that we need to respond to and when.
Thank you, Beck. Thank you very much indeed for your questions. I'm going to let the panellists, because we are now really out of time. Last couple of seconds each, please, all of you. Just a final thought of what message, what call to action you'd like to leave with the audience. Colin, very briefly.
Thank you. Clearly, the consideration is the compounding impact of disasters. And we know communities go through floods and drought and heat waves, the same community. And it does disrupt the social fabric of those communities. The second message is historical data, and lots of discussion around data, predictions, use past experience. Gone are the days we can just look in the rearview mirror to forecast and to look at the future. We need to look at what's ahead, what lies, what's coming. How often we hear this unprecedented type of events. We need to plan for that.
Okay, Colin, thank you. Alison.
We're facing a really complex time, and I think from an Australian government point of view, what we're really looking to do is make sure that we can strengthen the hand of international standards setting so that we've got a single source of truth and a harmonised approach to standards that mean that we can have a coordinated, not fragmented global response. So harmonisation for me is the key.
Thank you. Kiri.
Well, I just basically want to say no man left behind, right? So that's also a message that's been going out. Remember our vulnerable. Thank you for that. But yeah, just we all need to move forward together. Yeah. So.
Thank you, Kiri. Chantal.
I think we've heard, as the Standardization community, key messages that we need to continue to improve, and we need to continue to have conversations to make sure that we meet the needs. Collaboration is key, and we need to continue to, again, it's improvement for me and good messages received to what can we do to be of even more value.
Thank you, Chantal. And Beck?
Yeah, look, I love standards. I'm going to be really frank. I love them. I think they're really important, and that's why I'm here today. I think we need certainly clarification of language. So how do we get language standardised? How do we get the tools and structures standardised for the way we do things? But how do we kind of actually then collaborate? And I think, you know, the carbonisation that's described here, I would completely agree with across the world, but also within our own places that help us drive and make changes, decisions together more easily.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. This has been a great discussion. Thank you for your questions. If you want to carry on the discussion, 10:15 tomorrow in the Unplugged Corner, 10:15 to 10:45, that is the Urban Resilience Preserving Paradise session. Thank you so much. Thank you. Straight after lunch for another session.